I'd like to invite an accountant to the stage that everybody knows, and that's Grant Corderoy, who Grant and we work closely together on the Plan B, and we discussed what we presented here 2 weeks ago for a couple of hours up on the Central Coast where our paths crossed. And he's going to give us a bit of insight into the liquidity discussion and how that policy came about and the implications. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm a happy accountant today, just remember that. And also thanks for the sobering thoughts and also talking about obesity. So I've pulled my stomach in so I can get into aged care when I need to. I've been involved with aged care since 1982, which makes me a veteran of aged care. Now, the theme today, of course, is about the Leaders Summit, and I certainly concur with the general theme before that I think it's not up to government. I now think very much the settings are for the providers to really start setting the agenda. So I'm going to be talking about residential and home care, but I want to have a lens all the way through to retirement living. Now, one of the big disappointments that I've had when we look at that is that when we talk the Royal Commission, now the number of things I wasn't so keen on, but I do always refer to Recommendation 25. So Recommendation 25 said we should have one aged care system, one entry point, everyone gets assessed, there's funding, and then they can choose where they're going to receive it. Makes absolute sense. We've had a silo system and it's been at our disadvantage since the start. We've got, CHSP, we've got HCP, we've got residential, and then we've got this thing called retirement living, independent living units, which is state-based tenancy under their legislation. Are we any closer? No. We've pushed back HCP and CHSP merging to 2027 as a minimum. We've got support at home and we don't know what's going on there, and we've got residential. So this is not good. Now, of course, the Equality Commission on the 18th of February suddenly decided that retirement living is part of aged care. They did that with their liquidity calculations, and we'll talk about that later. But it is part of aged care. It's also a very important part if we're going to have rehabilitation before or trying to delay the entry. So when I look at it, and these are figures we've seen before, the projected demand for aged care. Now today, it's at just over 212,000 people is a demand for aged care in residential. It's going to go up to 252,000 by 2030 based on the figures, and then it's going to go up another 100,000. So we've got this massive increase in the demand for residential aged care, which has been pretty static over the last 5 years. But then overlay that with the demand for in-home care. That's both CHSP and HCP using today's terms, or support at home going forward. It's going from 1.16 million up to 1.6 million people. Now, just by way of reference, that increase in home care, the figures for the increase in demand in residential care takes into account the fact that we're going to have more people requiring home care. But we're going to have a curve. And we talked about the baby boomers coming in and the changes. So we've got a plan and how we're going to get that. And I'll keep on overlaying where does retirement living or seniors housing come into that area. Now, we talk about approved places. So today, look at the static. Now, what an approved place is, we've got 223,000 approved places, but we don't have 223,000 actual places. We've got about 208,000 available places. A number of places have never been built, even though they've been approved, or they've converted them from 2 and 3 bed down to a 1 bed or change the area. So we've got to start off by saying we've got about 208,000 available beds today, and we've got a demand getting up to 210,000. We can see the maths. But look at the last 5 years of approved places. It's gone from 217 to 223, an extraordinary slow progression. And why have we had this? Of course, we've had the financial effects. We haven't had a sector for 5 years plus. We've lost money. Over $5 billion has gone out of the residential aged care sector in the last 5 over years. That's not a really good place to be wanting to invest. Now, the Minister talks about the sector has to be investable. I quite like that discussion because we talk about sustainable. Now, sustainable's maintaining the same level today. Investable is saying what is it going to make that existing providers want to keep investing and growing and new entries come in and wanting to invest in it. So we've got to get a level far greater than what we're aiming for. But is the government going to dictate this? So as a member of the task force is there to look at improving the financial sustainability of the sector. That was its only goal. Fantastic goal, very lofty. Of course, I was the only accountant on the task force, which is odd, isn't it? Here we're talking about how do we improve the financial sustainability of the sector. Now, what that did do, it gave me a much greater voice. And also we were able to use a lot of the modelling that we've been doing for a number of years. So you see the task force recommendations have got a familiar flavour to them, if you look at our reporting over the last 3 or 4 years before. We also worked hard and we got bipartisan support for Chapter 4. So basically we've now got the two major parties agreeing on the funding. Great start. But now we've got to work what's beyond that, because things are happening since the task force. And I'll look at support at home in a minute. So let's just see how the results for the 12 months ending December. Now, this is the salient point of where we are. So happy days. We've actually got a surplus for the 6 months ending, December, a modest surplus. Great news after 5.5 years of deficits, operating deficits. Not much of a surplus, I might add. But where does it come from? Well, this is the direct care, and this is a cautionary note, because this is ANAC, which is paying for your direct care needs, and it's paying for meeting an average of 215 minutes from 1 October. And look at the margin, a significant margin. In other words, the taxpayer through ANAC is paying a significantly more than the costs of providing that service. Now, we think there should be a margin. The Pricing Authority agrees with us, but that margin will erode. And let's talk about next April. We've heard two things. We're going to have funding in arrears over 2 years to be introduced, but next April, you're going to effectively being paid for the services that you provide. So this transitional margin that we had will start to erode, because from April, you'll be funded for your actual hours that you've maintained. And we've seen that, so we'll see that margin coming down to probably somewhere between $8 to $12 for an efficient sort of area. So, everyday living, catering, cleaning, laundering is running at a loss. So who's paying for that loss? Every provider is paying for that loss. So where did that money come from? It comes from the margin they're getting in direct care. Now that will be rectified. That was one of the big points of the task force recommendations, which is now enshrined, that people who can afford, who are not fully supported, will pay for the cost of everyday living. That's a great initiative, and one we do, as we do all our life. So we'll see that margin at least come to break even rather than a loss, and hopefully with a proper higher everyday living fee, HELF. Don't we just love acronyms? We cannot do any new policy without giving it an acronym. So we've now got HELF, which I think should be HELP, but it's going to be the area where we can hopefully get more of a margin there. But if we look at the next one, that's accommodation. So what's the future in residential aged care? And I want you to think the retirement living now, and there is accommodation. We're losing $11 a day. So in other words, the providers are paying $11 a day for outside for accommodation. That is not a satisfactory level. So the task force said we want to have a retention, the 2%. We said 3%, and of course Treasury, we've heard before, they thought, oh, we'll make it 2%. I think it'll edge up. But it said we can take a retention of RADs. But we've got to start changing it. And this is where accommodation is so important, because that is where the future. Yes, we've got to always provide quality care. Yes, we've got to provide rehabilitation. We're getting funded for that. The taxpayer, quite correctly and uniquely in Australia, only Japan has a higher level of funding for for your direct care in the world as a percentage, we're getting that. And the pricing authority, their charter is to maintain it. But now it's up to the providers to suddenly say, how do we provide the everyday living services that residents want, and how do we provide accommodation? Because the other thing that's happening on 1 July is a new Aged Care Act. Now, what is a new Aged Care Act? We talked all about it, but what's the hidden thing? The hidden thing is it's now formally there's no ACAR. So formally there's no such thing as having an approved place. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that when someone's assessed for care, they can then choose where they're going to receive that care. So they can start to choose, we might receive it in an independent living type accommodation. It's really going to change the nature. We're going to see assisted living. You know, what goes around comes around. We had assisted living in the 1990s. It went. Now suddenly we're talking about assisted living again. But it's going to be the providers who are providing independent living units, seniors housing, who are going to take a dominant role. So despite the Quality Commission's, I think, inadvertent trying to legislate the retirement living, yes, it is part of aged care, even though it's not mentioned too much in the Aged Care Act. But it's going to be a driver of what happens. And we've got to make certain that people pay for the right price for accommodation. So this is now up to the providers. You know, we've increased the RAD. We can go $750,000 for a RAD, you know, before we're seeking pricing authority approval. I'd like to reverse it around. Where have we got to go to change the whole method when we're looking at accommodation? Rather than talk RADs of $750,000, which most people don't understand, I always say, if I go to a barbecue and say, you know something about aged care, and I talk RADs and DAPs, that discussion lasts about 10 seconds. I've got very used to speaking to myself at barbecues, but now we change it. What we can now say, you get a retention, yes, but let's reverse it. If I went to a CFO and I said to the CFO, how much are you getting for your direct care? They'd say to me, oh, we average about $290, $295 ANAC. Yeah, tick. How much are you getting for everyday living? What's your revenue stream for everyday living? And they'll sort of say it's a combination of a basic daily fee and we get a hotelling supplement. I'd like to say, what is it? Get a figure. What's your revenue stream for accommodation? And they'd look at me. Well, how about we try to change it? How about we try to work out what do we need for rent? Because you don't buy an aged care room, you rent it. Now, this is where we can learn from retirement living again, how they approach it. But what can we do for rent? And work out what we need to get as a rental return that's appropriate for improving our accommodation, driving our accommodation, and start from that basis. Then we know we're going to have supportive people. Unfortunately, the accommodation supplement's too low. We've got to fix that. We're going to get people who pay a contribution. We call it a RAD. I prefer to say a contribution. And we're getting people who want a daily rent. And start off by advertising rent, because the hardest thing for anyone going to aged care is to determine what's the rent and what's it going to cost. And then we can say it's going to cost $230 a day for full board and lodging, everything you want in that home, or it could be $280 for this home, or whatever the circumstances. So we've got a great opportunity now to change it and to do it. And this is in the providers area. These three scenarios I don't want to talk about in great area, but if you look at scenario one, that's continuing today's type area, $13,000 per bed per annum, EBITDA. Scenario two is a modest improvement in our accommodation. Scenario three is where we want to get there, where we're providing accommodation for the right price, about $19,000 or $20,000 a bed, which is what we need. Because today, you know, the average age of when beds opened, a nursing home open or a aged care home open, is over 26 years. It's had refurbishments, but we've still got a lot of old stock and a lot of stock that was originally built as a hostel. Now, of course, we need to get stability. So in home care, we've got a challenge. We've got support at home, which we still don't know anything about to any great extent. We've got pricing, and we've got a 1 year's delay on the pricing in a sense. But what happened outside of the of the task force was this 10% cap on care management. Came out of the blue. So what we're saying, we have to now increase our margin for our pricing. We've got to start pricing our services accordingly, because we're not going to get a package management and we're only going to get a maximum of 10% for care management. So we've got to inbuild those additional costs into our margin. So we've got to increase our margin for our direct care delivery in home care from about 12% to about 31, 32%. It's going to see a price increase of somewhere between 25 and 35%. We've also got to get a greater return. So we need to understand what the market wants, and we need to understand where we're going to get it. And it's going to be delivered a lot into that independent living unit seniors housing area. Because as Chris has said, we're entering age between 77 and 79 years. So we enter why? We want it to be our last place of residence. It's not a transition. I don't think anyone in this room and myself look as a career option to end up in aged care home. We'd like to stay in our own home setting as long as we can, and the obvious place going forward is going to fix a lot of these builds that we need is in a seniors housing, independent living unit, land lease type area where care is delivered, and we get more care there, and then have assisted living, and then move to an aged care home if, and only remember the statistics, only 55% transition to an aged care home. And in home care, it's the same statistic. Currently, 52% go to residential aged care. The other 48% pass while receiving it. And that's not a bad statistic. So we've got to look for that going forward. So, prudential and liquidity. You love it. Quality Commission. One of the big mistakes, and maybe here, that the Royal Commission made is said prudential and financial should come under the Quality Commission. You know, we've got too many statutory authorities looking at it. We've got the Pricing Authority. But the fundamental thing I want to say is we've got a very resilient sector. The balance sheet of providers is still strong. We've undergone COVID, we've undergone 5+ years of losses, we've undergone $5 billion, which is basically a capital strike. But, of course, I'm an accountant, I just love putting a balance sheet. Anytime I go, I can carry a balance sheet around. And look at this balance sheet. Assets, liabilities and net assets. We've got a very strong sector. If you look at the net assets, this is per provider, average per provider, $100 million or so of net assets. And net assets compared to your total assets, you know, is 25%. Liquidity is still strong. In fact, we've got an excess liquidity at the moment because we haven't been investing in the sector. Because why would we? Our returns are marginal, 0.1%, 0.2% at best. So we've now got excess liquidity. And this is our argument with the Quality Commission's formula, because they came out with, as we know, the 35. So that on the 18th of February, in the dead of night, we've now got this new strategy. It's going to be 35% of your cash expenses of 1 month, 10% for your RADs and 10% for your ILUs. I had my first meeting with the Quality Commission, believe it or not, the next day, because they invited us for a meeting to have a talk about it. And I said, well, let's just talk some facts. So we did. We did an extensive survey, got over 55% of beds in Australia in the survey, so it's a data set that's stronger than their data set, and we looked at it. And what the facts were is that our current liquidity is about 24% on average. Their formula was going to go up to 58% on average. And if you're a large provider, it was going to go up to 77%. 70% you've got to maintain in liquid cash assets. Well, not going to do too much development there. So that's the big message. I don't think the sector is in financial disarray. I think it's fundamentally strong. So with that fundamentally strong, we've got to make certain that we get, yes, they've got a role to play, and I think a proper role to manage the prudential and affairs of the sector. But we don't have a role to take out much needed liquidity. I think we've got an excess liquidity, and we now have to get the other settings right to be able to move the excess liquidity. Now, as you know, our survey in Stuart Brown, of course, in aged care and our disability has been going for 30 years. 30 years ago, I started the aged care sector, and I'm showing every minute of it. But what we now realise over a while is that many of the providers are providing home care, of course, and are providing retirement living. So we want to do the merge. This is the merging of what we're doing at our survey to look at it, to, in a sense, complement the very good survey that the Property Council does, but we want to get more granular and we want to show the difference between the merging as we're getting more care delivered into retirement living. So our survey is going to focus very much on that intersection of care into retirement living, and I think it's going to be really important going forward. 5 seconds over time. Sorry, Chris. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. We are slightly over time and we're trying to keep the time, but you did mention something in there early in your discussion which made me sit up. You said that retirement living is the place to go, people will be ageing there, and it will result in the department looking at it and putting in policy requirements and so on. Do you feel that that's really going to be the case?
Well, I think they attempted it, but I think they've now got to understand accommodation is not a government responsibility. They've got a responsibility to make certain accommodations commensurate and we're not gouging, but it's not their responsibility. We've got to now as a sector say, we want to handle the accommodation. The settings are, once I've assessed for aged care, I can get that care in accommodation that I choose to get to. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to say, focus on the care that's delivered into independent living units, not focus on the accommodation setting.
And one second question, very briefly. You heard about the liquidity ratios the day after they were announced. You're normally consulted on all these things. For the room, we've asked everybody and everybody said, we have no idea where this came from. Was it a surprise? Where did it come from? Quick answer.
It came from the Royal Commission to start off with. The Royal Commission, of course, in one of their recommendations, 132, said the Quality Commission should be looking after the potential arrangements. And so they've taken it over and they felt that they've got to put in some formula, a formulaic approach to sort of say, how do we measure liquidity? Because we don't want to see failure. There hasn't been that much failure anyway, but they wanted to see failure. So I think the idea that they should have a role in management, in oversight is good and fine, but they should do it as an ongoing role, just communicating.
I suppose my question is, who did they consult in the sector? Where did they come up with these numbers?
They didn't consult with anyone. They had their own actuaries and they relied on their own actuarial advice. At one of the webinars, the actuaries were there. They've got a health background, which is fine, not an aged care background. And I think they just had an actuarial assessment that came up. And what it said was, actually, that if we put in these settings, over 85 or 90% of all providers comply. But I made the point, comply to what? We're complying to a higher level of liquidity that we need to be using. So it's based on an actuary that, as far as I'm concerned, we've never seen the actuarial results and it hasn't been disclosed. And it certainly was a shock to the sector. So
my point being, the sector needs to develop a voice and leadership, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. And we put submissions in. And I think we've got to say, we want to use that liquidity for the purposes that we've got it to. But
Grant, we put in submissions all the time. How many submissions do you put in a year?
Not too many.
Yeah. So the system isn't working in that respect. But we might have this conversation with others because we've got to keep an eye on the time. Can we show our appreciation to Grant?